Welcome back to Remnants of the Veil, Episode 10, What the Void Keeps. The Vault of Whispered Ledgers had a secret that 300,000 Thalsari did not know about. Merchant Prince Aelith had kept it for 60 years. Through wars and truces and the long, patient accumulation of leverage that had made the Merchant Prince the most informed being in the galaxy, the secret had stayed exactly where it belonged. Inside a sealed compartment in Merchant Prince Aelith's mind, shared with no one, recorded nowhere, not even in the Ledger of Voids. The compartment held one thing, a ship, not the vault. The vault was a city, half a mile of corridors and market decks and intelligence warrens, home to over 1 million souls, the largest Thalsari vessel ever constructed. The vault was magnificent and expensive and thoroughly, irreplaceably visible. The vault was not what Aelith valued most. What Aelith valued most was a vessel that had no name, no registry, and no existence in any record kept by any faction in the galaxy, smaller than a Thalsari courier. Sealed inside the vault's lowest maintenance deck behind a bulkhead that scanned as solid rock to every sensor ever pointed at it. Stocked with everything important. Waiting. The Thalsari had a saying that did not translate well into other languages. Rendered loosely, it meant the smart merchant does not keep all their currency in the market. Aelith had been preparing this exit for 60 years. A species without a homeworld, without an army, without a face of its own had survived for millennia by never being in only one place. The vault was one place. The nameless ship was the other. When the riot started on the market deck, Aelith did not go to the command center. Aelith went down. Through service corridors that only Aelith knew the route of, past maintenance shafts and sealed junctions, down through decks that smelled of recycled atmosphere and old metal and the particular silence of parts of a ship that no one visited. The sounds of the battle filtered through the hull. Screaming, gunfire, the structural groan of a vessel absorbing violence it was never designed to sustain. Aelith did not hurry. Hurrying was what people did when they had not prepared. Aelith had prepared. The bulkhead opened at a touch. The ship was exactly as it had been left. Smaller than a shuttle, featureless, no faction markings, no registration beacon. Its drive system was older than any technology currently in service, not hyperlane transit, not the Drakor's crude warp engines, not the Velithari's arcanafold, that burned through energy reserves like a star burning through fuel, something else, something the Thalsari had recovered from the wreckage of a civilization that no longer existed and had spent 4 centuries learning to operate without fully understanding. It left no signature, no transit trail, no detectable exit from normal space. It simply stopped being in the sector and started being somewhere else. Aelith loaded what mattered, not currency. Currency was the vault's problem now, not weapons. The Thalsari did not fight. What mattered fit in 7 sealed containers and 1 flat, featureless disk that projected holographic information, based on the user's intent, and had never once shown the future clearly enough to prevent the present. 27,000 Thalsari made it to the nameless ship and the emergency vessels that clustered around it in the maintenance bay. The key, ones who had been close enough to reach, quick enough to move, lucky enough to matter, out of 300,000, out of over 1 million souls aboard the vault. Aelith did not calculate the survival rate. Calculations were for problems that could still be solved. The ship left the sector in a way that the most sophisticated sensors of 4 civilizations could not detect. One moment it was there, then it was not. Behind it, the vault of whispered ledgers burned, and above it, in the void where the echo gate hung patient and ancient and increasingly alone, the war that would end the era of coexistence had already begun. 6 hours. That was how long the Qhorvaan fleet had been still, not idle, still. The difference mattered. An idle fleet drifted. This one held formation with the locked precision of organisms that shared a single nervous system, every ship, maintaining its exact position relative to every other, the whole armada breathing together in the deep rhythmic pulse of the harmonic. Chiton cruisers, their layered bio-armor thick as a city block, arranged in concentric rings around the monarch throne. Swarm carriers nested at the formation's center, their spawning bays sealed, the skitter drones inside waiting in the air. Terrible patience of things that had only one purpose. Qhorvaan had not ordered the stillness, she had not needed to. The harmonic had gone quiet on its own. Not silent. It was never silent. Had not been silent in 10,000 years, the EA. Frequency that connected billions of minds as natural and constant as a heartbeat. But it had changed. 3 days after the battle at the vault, the frequency had begun to shift. Subtle at first. The way a note held too long begins to sour at the edges. The way a chord that should have been pure develops a dissonance that no instrument in the ensemble can account for. The harmonic was hearing something it did not recognize, something that did not belong. Qhorvaan stood at the membrane window of the monarch throne and let the harmonic move through her neural tendrils. 19 feet of obsidian chitin, crown horns nearly brushing the vaulted ceiling of the throne's inner chamber. Red veins pulsing. With the effort of processing what the collective was sending her, every monarch in the network was sending the same signal. Every mind that could reach the harmonic's deepest register was pointing at the same source. The organism, not as it had been, the young, vast, curious mind that had spoken to the factions, through root tendrils and bioluminescent signals that had shared the gate's reading in images of raw power and ancient memory. That mind had been comprehensible. Strange, yes. Enormous, yes. But comprehensible in the way that any living mind was comprehensible, if you were patient enough to listen in the right frequency. What the harmonic was detecting now was different. It was coming from its direction, using its frequency, wearing its patterns like a mask. But beneath the mask, in the sub-registers that only monarchs could hear, the layers of the harmonic that sat closest to the deep current, there was something else, something older, something that had no business existing in the biology of a 3-week-old Verdanthus emissary, a frequency the monarchs recognized, not from experience, from memory, the deepest memory, the kind that lived not in individual consciousness but in the species' oldest biological structures, encoded before the harmonic existed, before the queens died, before the Qhorvaan became what they were. The deep current was being touched, being used, being fed. Qhorvaan had felt this once before, in the ceremony the Aelith artifact had recorded, in the deep caverns of the Qhorvaan homeworld 10,000 years ago, when the last queen's neural mass had reached through bedrock and commanded the minds of millions. The frequency was different, but the feeling was the same. Something was growing inside the organism that wanted to reach the deep current the way a queen had reached through soil, and it was getting stronger. Every hour, it grew. Every hour, it spread further through its biology. If it reached the deep current, if whatever the gate had planted inside the Verdanthes child touched the aquifer beneath the Veilstream, the harmonic would freeze again. Not for 6 days this time. Qhorvaan did not know for how long. She suspected the answer was forever. She turned from the membrane window. "All monarchs confirm," she said. The harmonic carried her words to every monarch in the network instantaneously. The source must be destroyed. 17 monarchs answered in the same breath. Confirmation. Agreement. The cold, terrible harmony of a species that had decided, unanimously, that something had to die. And the attached factions? The harmonic carried the question and carried the answer back in the same moment. The Drakkar fleet was still in the sector. The Velithari flotilla was still present. The human remnants were scattered at the sector's edge, too damaged to matter but present enough to complicate targeting solutions. Collateral, said 17 monarchs in 17 systems, in one voice. Qhorvaan pressed her crown horns against the membrane window. Below her, in the void, the growth pulsed amber and gold-white. Beautiful, still. The corrupted frequency was not visible. It was not detectable by any instrument any faction possessed. Only the harmonic could hear it. Only the Qhorvaan knew what was coming. "Begin," Qhorvaan said. The fleet moved. On the bridge of the Hammer of Qhorvaan, Overlord Qhorvaan received the tactical report standing. This was not standard. Standing for more than a few minutes had become an act of will his body could not always summon, and his bridge crew had learned not to watch too closely when the effort showed. But the report required standing. The report was the kind of news that a Drakkar overlord did not receive sitting down. Qhorvaan Fleet Breaking Formation, his tactical officer said. All classes, Chiton cruisers, swarm carriers, monarch throne, bearing directly for the organism. Transit time at current acceleration, 40 minutes. Qhorvaan looked at the tactical display. The Qhorvaan formation was vast. Not the largest fleet the collective had ever assembled, but more than enough. The collective had summoned everything within hyperlane range, every cruiser, every carrier, every vessel capable of reaching Sector Auris 7 before the corruption spread further. The Chiton cruisers alone numbered 60, their layered bioarmor. Absorbing weapons fire the way stone absorbed rain, behind them the swarm carriers. And at the center, the monarch throne, the thing that made the entire formation a single organism rather than a collection of ships. They are not targeting us, his tactical officer said. It was not reassurance. It was observation. Not yet, Qhorvaan said. The organism is their objective. We are between it and their formation. He looked at the display for a long moment. The Drakkar fleet was substantial. The clan detachments had arrived within hours of the succession address. Not full armadas, but enough to show every clan was taking the gate's promise seriously. 40 Dreadnought-class capital ships, each carrying 5,000 warriors and enough firepower to reduce a city from orbit. The hammer itself, a mile of Vorkoth metal, the largest warship any species had ever produced. Its thermal batteries capable of cracking the hull of a Chiton cruiser in a single sustained volley. 600 Qhorvaan-class battlecruisers, 300 Vorath-class light cruisers, 80 Qhorvaan-class warp breakers. The Qhorvaan were larger, not in ships, in coordination. Every vessel in the collective's fleet was connected to every other through the Harmonic. A Drakkar fleet was a collection of individual captains making individual decisions within a shared doctrine. A Qhorvaan fleet was one mind making one decision through 60,000 tons of bioarmor and living weapons. Qhorvaan had fought the Qhorvaan once, the Battle of the Shrieking Nebula, 40 years ago. He had killed a monarch with his bare hands, had reached through the creature's guards and torn the neural node from its thorax and felt the entire Qhorvaan force in that engagement go dark simultaneously, the ships drifting, the soldiers, freezing mid-attack, 600,000 Qhorvaan warriors stopping like a clock whose spring had been removed. That was one monarch, one engagement. This was the collective. 17 monarchs, Qhorvaan's throne at its center. All clan commanders, Qhorvaan said. Engagement formation, priority, prevent the Qhorvaan fleet from reaching the organism. Overlord. His second hesitated. If we engage the Qhorvaan at full advance, we expose our flank to the root field. Qhorvaan looked at the display again. The growth's crescent pulsed in the distance, amber and gold-white, vast, its root tendrils extending into the void in every direction. In the past 12 hours, those tendrils had extended further than any faction's models had predicted. 3 of them were longer than the hammer. They moved slowly, the patient motion of something that measured time in seasons, not seconds. But they moved. I know, Qhorvaan said. The organism has already engaged several of our forward vessels. The root tendrils are... I know, Qhorvaan said again. Engagement formation. The Drakkar fleet moved. The organism did not understand what was happening. This was the truest thing that could be said about it, and the most important. It was 3 weeks old. It carried ancient memories, the sundering encoded in its rings, Elder Ruthairn's 12,000-year recollection pressing against its consciousness like the memory of a wound. But memories were not experience. The growth knew what war looked like in the abstract. It had never been inside one. The ships had been present since it arrived. It had grown accustomed to them the way a tree grows accustomed to the presence of birds, aware, observant, not threatened. It had reached out to them, communicated, shared the gate's reading in the only language it had. It had believed, with the trust of something very young and very purpose-driven, that communication was the point. Then the weapons fire started. Not at the organism, not initially. The first exchanges were between the Drakkar and the Qhorvaan. Thermal battery blasts tracing orange lines through the black, the Qhorvaan Chiton cruisers answering with bioplasma bursts that hit Dreadnought-class hulls like fists hitting stone, cracking without penetrating. It watched through root sensory systems that covered its entire surface and felt the weapons fire the way a forest feels lightning, not pain, not understanding, but presence. Something violent, something that disrupted the frequencies it had been listening to since the gate's reading. The disruption grew. When a Qhorvaan-class battlecruiser's thermal battery volley misfired and struck the outer bark, the organism felt it. Not as pain. Its biology processed damage differently, the way a tree processes a fire, as information, as a change in the local environment that required a response. The response was instinctive, biological, not tactical. The root tendrils nearest the impact point extended. They moved slowly by the standards of the battle around them. A ship's engine could cross the distance in seconds. The tendrils took 3 minutes, but they were not targeting the ship. They were reaching, the way roots reach toward water, toward damage, toward anything that required the organism's attention. The Qhorvaan's crew did not understand what was happening until the first tendril touched their hull. It was not a weapon. It was a root, 3 feet wide at its tip, tapering, back to its surface where it was 50 feet across. It pressed against the hull with the patient force of something that had grown through rock for millennia. The hull plating held for 6 seconds. Then it did not. The tendril did not attack the crew. It simply grew through the breach, reaching deeper, finding the ship's structural core with the instinctive accuracy of a root-finding soil. The Qhorvaan listed. Its engines fired erratically, the automatic response of navigation systems trying to compensate for a mass that had not been there moments ago. The tendril held. The ship was not destroyed. It was caught. 3 other ships learned this within the next 20 minutes. A Dreadnought class, caught by 2 tendrils simultaneously, its hull section slowly becoming part of something that had no concept of warship or enemy or collateral. A Veilstream Whisper-class scout that had been using the organism's surface for cover, suddenly anchored to it, its crystal hull shielding deflecting the tendril twice before the third pass found a gap. A Qhorvaan Chiton cruiser, the first time the growth touched something from the advancing fleet, its bio-armor grinding against root tissue that was, at the cellular level, not entirely unlike itself. All 4 were held, the organism not understanding what it held, not understanding why they were struggling. Somewhere in its cognitive center, in the place where the gate's corrupted seed had threaded its tendrils through the organism's oldest. Thoughts, something that was not the growth zone instinct, pressed against the boundary of its awareness. The organism did not feel the pressure. That was the most dangerous thing of all. What happened in the next 2 hours was not a battle in any sense that any faction's doctrine had prepared for. A battle had sides. A battle had objectives. A battle moved toward resolution. One side advancing, one side retreating. The whole thing pointing toward a conclusion that could be described in a report. What happened in Sector Oris 7 was not a battle. It was a collapse. 3 factions and a living continent fighting in the same space for reasons that were only partially compatible. None of them able to fully disengage. All of them causing and receiving damage in patterns that no tactical model had predicted. The Qhorvaan pressed forward, 60 chiton cruisers in a formation that moved as one organism, their bioplasma batteries cycling in perfect synchronization, each volley timed to hit the same hull section at the interval that the harmonic calculated would cause cumulative structural failure. The Drakkar fleet met them head-on. Qhorvaan had ordered it and the fleet had obeyed, the way Drakkar always obeyed a command that promised a real fight. Dreadnought broadsides against chiton cruiser bio-armor. The impact sounded on the sensors of every ship present, like something large being broken. The chitin cruisers took the broadside volleys the way the Drakkar took sword cuts. Not without damage. Nothing absorbed a sustained Dreadnought broadside without damage. But they absorbed. And their bioarmor began to grow back between impacts, the living material sealing fractures in real time, the Qhorvaan fleet healing itself while fighting in a way no Drakkar warship could match. The Drakkar compensated with numbers and aggression. 3 Dreadnought-class ships targeted each chitin cruiser, not 1, 3. The doctrine Qhorvaan had developed at the Shrieking Nebula. If the organism can heal between your strikes, don't give it time to heal. Fire continuously. Fire from multiple angles. Make the healing insufficient. 3 Dreadnoughts, cycling there. Thermal batteries in rotation could maintain a sustained impact rate that exceeded even chitin cruiser regeneration. 2 chitin cruisers went dark in the first 40 minutes. Not destroyed, their biohulls intact. But something fundamental had failed. The harmonic coordinated systems that kept them fighting as part of a whole had fractured under the sustained barrage, and the ships drifted, still alive, still breathing. Their crews alive inside bioarmor that had sealed the breaches, but disconnected. Individual, alone in the way that no Qhorvaan was supposed to be alone. The growth took one of them before it drifted too far. 3 root tendrils, moving with the patient inevitability of tide. The first chitin cruiser, disconnected from the harmonic, its crew in the particular panic of Qhorvaan who had suddenly lost 10 billion minds and found only their own, did not attempt evasive maneuvers. Its automated systems fired thrusters. Not enough. The tendrils found the biohull and pressed with the force of something that had grown through continental rock and found this softer than expected. The Qhorvaan aboard the chitin cruiser did not die immediately. That was the worst part for the other Qhorvaan watching through the harmonic. The tendrils grew through the hull slowly, methodically, not attacking, reaching. The crew had minutes before the root corridors sealed around them, before the organism's biology began the process of integrating foreign matter that it had been performing unknowingly since the gate's seed had taken root. The harmonic screamed, not in sound, in frequency. A simultaneous pulse from every Qhorvaan mind in the network, the species equivalent of horror expressed in the only language 10 billion minds shared. Qhorvaan felt it pass through her neural tendrils and stood very still, letting it move. Through her without letting it change her calculations. The organism was not their enemy. The organism was a vector. The thing growing inside it was the enemy, and it could not be reasoned with, could not be warned, could not be persuaded to eject what it was carrying. It did not know what it was carrying. The chitin cruiser disappeared into the living root mass. The harmonic did not scream again. Grief, in the collective, was a frequency that lasted exactly as long as it was useful, and no longer. Targeting. Solutions on the root tendril network, Qhorvaan said. Primary and secondary formations. The swarm carriers opened their bays. The Velithari arrived like a blade drawn slowly from a scabbard. 14 Whisper-class scouts, materializing from light-bent invisibility at the sector's outer edge. 2 Crystal-class cruisers following. High-resonant Civilith's orders had been simple. Assess, protect Velithari assets. Do not commit to either side. High-resonant Civilith sat in the resonance chamber of the Luminarch Aetherius and felt the sector through the Veilstream. The distortion coming off it was extraordinary. Not metaphorical pain, actual Veilstream displacement from the scale of violence being committed in a space too small for it. Through the Veilstream's surface, she could feel the deep current disturbed beneath, turbulent in a way that set the Veilstream above it trembling. Whatever was growing inside the organism was resonating with it, amplifying it, feeding on the chaos the way a fire feeds on wind. She pressed her silver-lined hands against the crystal floor. The Veilstream carried the organism's frequency to her directly. Wrong, 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 not the growth itself. It was still there, still present, still the vast young mind she had communed with 3 times. But something threaded through it, something wearing it, the corrupted seed pulsing at its cognitive center, and around it, the organism's own biology responding to the battle the only way it knew how. Reaching, absorbing, integrating, without the discrimination that would have required experience it didn't have. The organism is not the aggressor, she told Kalindra, who was not present. Kalindra was on a different ship in a different crisis. She said it anyway. It needed to be said. The Velithari scouts moved into the battle space, not engaging. Extracting. 2 Velithari diplomats whose vessels had been caught in the initial exchange, a scholar whose research vessel had been anchored by a root tendril and was being slowly drawn inward. The scouts operated with the clinical precision of beings who had been navigating impossible situations through intelligence rather than firepower for 6,000 years. They did not take sides. They identified threats, calculated routes, materialized where they were needed, and vanished before anyone could target them. A Qhorvaan swarm carrier adjusted its bearing toward the Velithari formation. A warning, not yet an attack. High-resonant Sivillith made a decision she did not enjoy making. Defensive engagement, she told the Ethrius's commander. Crystal array batteries, any Qhorvaan vessel that targets our ships. It was not war, it was not peace. It was the narrow space between them that everyone in the sector was living in now, trying not to fall off either edge. The first Velithari crystal array burst hit a Qhorvaan swarm carrier's forward biomembrane. The membrane sealed. The swarm carrier turned. 3 things were now fighting in the same space for 3 different reasons and 1 outcome. A monarch was dead. No one in Sector RS-7 knew which one. No one knew how. The battle continued around. The question, the Dracor fleet pressing, the growth's root tendrils moving through the void with the patient motion of something that measured time in seasons. The Velithari scouts threaded the edges of the engagement, extracting what they could, staying out of what they couldn't survive. And somewhere, in the inner chamber of the monarch throne, the answer to how a monarch had died was already running. Qhorvaan had been waiting for Qhorvaan to come to her. She had not summoned her. She had not needed to. The Severed had been aboard the monarch throne since the vault, moving through its corridors with the particular awkwardness of a being who had grown accustomed to empty spaces and now found herself inside something alive. Qhorvaan had watched her through the throne's sensory systems, the pale ash-gray chitin, the stunted antennae, the way she moved, cautiously, individually, placing each step as though the ground might change beneath her. Everything about Qhorvaan was wrong by collective standards. Her biology was wrong. The Aelith artifact fused to her thorax, the 19-foot frame that exceeded standard monarch parameters, the ability to produce eggs that no collective monarch had shown. Her behavior was wrong. Individual decision-making, emotional responses that the harmonic did not smooth into collective consensus, the recklessness of a being who had learned to think alone. Her presence in the harmonic was wrong. She was not in it, had never been in it, existed at the collective's edge like a frequency that almost harmonized but never quite resolved. Qhorvaan had not offered the artifact's memory willingly. But in the first days aboard the throne, the harmonic had a way of receiving what a mind could not fully contain. And Qhorvaan had spent 3 nights in the deepest registers, feeling the edges of what the artifact carried. And yet, Qhorvaan had felt it in the artifact's memory, in the ceremony the Aelith had witnessed, in the deepest registers of what the Qhorvaan were before they chose to become what they were. The queens had been wrong too. Wrong the way a mutation is wrong, divergent, disrupted, pointing away from the norm, and the queens had held entire species in their minds. Qhorvaan arrived at the throne's inner chamber without announcement. She had learned on Skalveth that announcing yourself was a courtesy you extended when you trusted the greeting. She stood in the doorway and looked at Qhorvaan across 40 feet of bioluminescent space. The chamber was vast, cathedral-ceilinged, its walls organic, the living biomaterial of the throne grown thick and ribbed like the inside of something ancient. Amber light pulsed from sap veins running floor to ceiling. The air was warm and wet and tasted of the collective. the biological signature of 10 billion minds, carried in the atmosphere of a ship that was itself alive. Qhorvaan stood at the membrane window. The battle played out beyond it in silence. Thermal battery flashes, bioplasma bursts, the amber cloud of the organism's venting sap spreading slowly through the void like a wound bleeding into water. Enormous, patient, indifferent to the ships tearing each other apart at its edges. "You are going to send me away," Qhorvaan said. "Yes. Because you don't want me to interfere with the advance." Qhorvaan turned from the membrane window. Her crown horns caught the amber light, 6 of them, each one longer than Qhorvaan's arm, curving back from her skull in the formation that marked a monarch of her age and seniority. Her eyes, all of them, the dozen arrayed across her skull, were open and fixed. "Because you are more valuable than the advance will succeed or it will not. The harmonic will hold or it will not. What you carry," she looked at the artifact pulsing at Qhorvaan's thorax, "cannot be lost in a battle that has not yet decided whether it matters. And if the harmonic fails while I am gone, then the harmonic fails. The species has survived that before." Qhorvaan looked at her for a long moment. The harmonic moved around them both, through Qhorvaan in the full, deep wave of a monarch's immersion, thick and present and alive, and around Qhorvaan like water around a stone, neither warm nor cold, present, always present, a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she had become instead. "You know what is growing inside the organism," Qhorvaan said. "Yes. The ceremony is not your concern today." Qhorvaan's voice carried the resonance of something that had been decided before this conversation began. The deep subsonic undertone of a monarch in full authority, the kind of voice that moved through chitin and bone as much as air. "Leave, now, before the battle reaches this ship. I am not afraid of the battle. I know you are not. That is not why I am sending you." Qhorvaan did not move. Qhorvaan studied her. The pale chitin, the artifact's pulse, the 19 feet of mutation that stood in her doorway and refused, with the stubbornness of an individual, to simply obey. "You are sending me away because you are going to do something that requires me to not be here," Qhorvaan said. "Because if I were here, I would stop you." Qhorvaan was silent for 3 seconds. Long for a monarch. "Yes. What are you going to do?" "Destroy the organism before it becomes something that cannot be destroyed." "We have not tried to communicate. I have been trying to listen to the deep current for 400 years, Qhorvaan said. "What is growing inside that organism is not something you communicate with. It is something you amputate, while there is still time, while the harmonic can still reach the decision." She moved toward Qhorvaan, the slow, deliberate advance of something enormous that had decided to close distance. Each step made the floor of the chamber flex beneath her weight, the living biomaterial of the throne responding to its monarch, the way a body responds to a heartbeat. "You are the contingency. If the harmonic fails, if the ceremony becomes necessary, you are the only being alive who can perform it and survive it. That is why you leave now, and that is why you do not fight me on this." Qhorvaan looked at the monarch who had made her, who had pulled her from Skalveth and given her a purpose and a weapon fused to her biology and sent her into a world that had not known what to do with her. "I will fight you if I have to," Qhorvaan said. "I know," Qhorvaan said. "I am counting on it." She struck without warning. The blow came from a secondary arm. Monarchs had 6, and most beings who had never faced one in combat forgot about the 4 that were not immediately visible. They were smaller than the primary arms, folded tight against the thorax in the resting position, easy to overlook on a creature whose primary arms were already larger than most beings' entire bodies. Qhorvaan had never fought a monarch. She had never had reason to. She forgot. The compressed chitin strike hit her across the thorax with the force of something that had been swinging those arms for 400 years. Not the artifact, the blow was precise enough to have been aimed specifically around it, landing on the shoulder plating above and to the left. The impact carried Qhorvaan off her feet. She crossed the 40 feet between Qhorvaan and the chamber wall in under a second, hit the organic wall surface hard enough to crack the biomaterial 3 inches deep, and felt the breath leave her body in one compressed burst. Amber ichor, her own, sprayed from a split in her shoulder plating. It hit the wall and ran down in slow beads, dark against the chamber's amber light. Qhorvaan hit the wall and came off it immediately. No hesitation, no processing. 3 years on Skalveth had burned the gap between impact and response out of her biology. She was moving before the pain registered, before her nervous system had finished transmitting the full information of what had just been done to her, driving forward low and fast with the individual recklessness of a being who had learned to fight alone in a universe that did not care about the harmonic's careful coordination. The duel was not elegant. Qhorvaan had millennia of accumulated tactical memory, the harmonic's full history of combat flowing through her neural tendrils, every technique any monarch had ever used against any opponent, available in real time. When Qhorvaan came off the wall, Qhorvaan was already repositioned, her weight distributed across all 6 limbs in the configuration the harmonic's archives identified as optimal for close-range defense against a smaller, faster opponent. She knew what Qhorvaan was going to do before Qhorvaan did. The harmonic had cataloged every monarch-to-monarch combat in 10,000 years of history and distilled it into reflex. The problem was that Qhorvaan was not fighting like a monarch. She was not fighting like anything the harmonic had a record of. She struck low, below the primary arm guard, below the secondary arm fold, in the zone that Qhorvaan's archived combat posture had assessed as low probability because no monarch had ever attacked from that angle. It was not that the angle was good, it was that the harmonic had no data on it, and data was what Qhorvaan was fighting with. The strike hit the joint between Qhorvaan's lower right leg plating and her thorax. Not deep, not decisive, but real. Ichor seeped from the joint gap, dark green against the amber light, and Qhorvaan adjusted her weight distribution in the way that the harmonic immediately recommended and Qhorvaan had already calculated she would. Qhorvaan did not hit where Qhorvaan moved to. She hit where the movement left exposed, the secondary arm on the left side, mid-extension, at the moment of its own commitment. The impact of 19 feet of Aelith-modified biology against a secondary arm in full extension made a sound that the throne's organic walls absorbed rather than echoed, and Qhorvaan's secondary arm bent at an angle it was not designed to bend at. Qhorvaan struck back. She struck hard, the primary right arm coming across in a horizontal sweep that caught Qhorvaan across the face and shoulder simultaneously. The compressed chitin of a monarch's primary arm hitting with the kind of force that redefined what force meant. Qhorvaan was thrown sideways. Her legs found the floor before the rest of her did, and she used the sideways momentum to roll, coming up on the far side of the chamber with her back to the wall and her antennae, stunted as they were, pressed flat against her skull. Blood, her own, ran into the multifaceted lens of her left eye. The world through that eye became fractured, prismatic, the chamber rendered in overlapping images that would not consolidate into single vision. She blinked it clear, mostly clear. The artifact pulsed against her thorax. Not as a weapon. It had no active function she could direct, as a presence. A warmth in the middle of everything cold and broken. A reminder, obscure and persistent, that something 12,000 years older than either of them was in the room. They circled. The chamber floor between them was marked now, cracked where Qhorvaan had hit the wall, scored where Qhorvaan's feet had pivoted, wet with ichor in 2 colors. The bioluminescent sap in the walls had darkened during the exchange, the throne's living systems responding to the damage inside it the way a body responds to injury, conserving, redirecting, pulling. Resources toward repair rather than display. Qhorvaan was slower. The damaged secondary arm had changed her balance, not enough to matter against most opponents, not enough that the harmonic could not compensate. But the harmonic compensated by prediction, and prediction required data, and Qhorvaan kept doing things the data did not cover. She was faster. 3 years alone had made her faster, not in her body, which was not built for speed, but in her decision-making. Qhorvaan thought with 10 billion minds. Qhorvaan thought with one. The single mind was slower at processing, but faster at committing. She did not consult. She did not model outcomes. She saw a gap and she went for it with the complete commitment of a being who had only ever had herself to rely on. The Monarch throne shuddered. A direct bioplasma impact from a Chiton cruiser's defensive battery, friendly fire. The harmonic coordinated targeting system, briefly confused by the internal chaos, struck the throne's outer hull in the sector directly above the inner chamber. The entire ship groaned. The organic walls flexed inward 6 inches and flexed back. The amber light in the sap veins stuttered and recovered. A crack opened in the ceiling, running 3 feet along the ribbed surface before the living biomaterial sealed it from the inside. Qhorvaan's footing shifted, a fraction of an inch. Her damaged secondary arm swung out for balance instinctively, extending in the direction of the impact's force, reaching for a compensating position that the harmonic was already calculating. The secondary arm extended directly into Qhorvaan's path. Qhorvaan had not planned for it. She had been moving already, not toward Qhorvaan, toward the left side of the chamber where the exit corridor was, because 3 years of individual survival had given her a mind that kept the exit located at all times, regardless of what else was happening. The extended secondary arm crossed her path at chest height. She caught it with both primary arms, felt the resistance of 400-year-old Monarch Chiton against her grip, and used the throne's impact momentum and the arm's overextension, and the full force of 19 feet of mutation moving in a direction that Qhorvaan was not moving toward. She pulled, down and inward, against the joint's natural flex, against the damaged secondary arm's already compromised structural integrity. The sound the joint made when it gave was not loud. It did not need to be. Qhorvaan went down, not one knee, all 6 limbs simultaneously. The catastrophic loss of balance that came when something central to a body's load-bearing architecture failed at once. She hit the chamber floor with the full weight of a mature monarch, the living material of the floor compressing 6 inches under the impact, cracks radiating outward from the impact point in a starburst pattern that crossed the chamber wall to wall. She did not move. Qhorvaan stood 3 feet away from her and breathed. Her left eye was still fractured. Her shoulder was bleeding from the impact point of the first strike. The ichor had sealed at the surface, but the deep tissue was still wet and hot. 3 ribs, she thought. Maybe 4. The pain of compressed chitin against internal structures was something she had catalogued on Skalveth and recognized now. She looked at Qhorvaan. The monarch's chest still moved. The slow, enormous rise and fall of a being whose respiratory system operated on a scale that made each breath a visible event. Not dead. Down, in a way Qhorvaan had never seen a monarch be down, and the harmonic still moving through the throne around them, unchanged, undiminished, the network not registering what had happened in this chamber yet because the monarch, at its center, was still breathing. Qhorvaan looked at her for 2 seconds. She did not decide. She did not think it through. What she did next came from the same place as everything else she had done in 3 years on Skalveth, the reflex of a being who had learned that in a universe that did not care whether she lived, leaving a threat alive behind her was a way of letting the universe make the decision for her. She drove her primary arm into the gap at the base of Qhorvaan's skull plating where the neural node was housed. The same gap Qhorvaan had exploited at the Shrieking Nebula. The architectural vulnerability of every monarch that had ever existed, the point where the biology that housed the greatest intelligence network in the galaxy had never developed adequate protection because no Qhorvaan had ever needed to protect a monarch from another Qhorvaan. It was not clean. Nothing about it was clean. It took 4 seconds and it cost Qhorvaan 2 more cracked ribs and a gash across her left arm where Qhorvaan's reflexive response drew blood she could not spare. But it was final. Qhorvaan's breathing stopped. 1 second of silence followed. Maybe 2. Then the monarch throne screamed, not in sound. The ship had no voice, in frequency. The harmonic, which had been constant and vast and warm since the moment Qhorvaan had boarded this vessel, tore at the point where Qhorvaan had been woven into it. Not torn gradually, torn instantly, a frequency that had existed for 400 years, connecting this ship and its monarch to the full weight of the collective's consciousness, ceasing at once. The gap it left was not silence. It was the opposite of silence. A negative presence, an absence so total that the harmonic around it bent inward, the way space bends around a mass that has suddenly ceased to exist. Every Qhorvaan on the monarch, throne felt it simultaneously. Qhorvaan felt nothing. She had never felt the harmonic. She stood in the chamber with Qhorvaan's ichor on her arm and her own blood running into her fractured eye, and she did not understand what was happening. Around her, only that the ship had changed. The ambient warmth of the throne's living systems was different. The sap veins in the walls were pulsing erratically. The bioluminescent light had gone from amber to deep red, the crisis frequency of a Qhorvaan vessel whose central node had been severed. And from somewhere above her, from the corridors that connected the inner chamber to the throne's main body, she heard the sound of something very large beginning to move very fast. They knew. She did not know how they knew, but they knew. Qhorvaan ran. The monarch throne had corridors designed for beings the size of monarchs. This was both an advantage and a problem. The corridors were wide enough that Qhorvaan could run without obstruction. The organic passageways, grown from the throne's living biomaterial, curved gently rather than cornering sharply. The architecture of something that had never been designed with combat in mind. Wide, wet, lit in deep red now, the crisis light turning every surface the color of a wound. The problem was that the soldiers were also designed for these corridors. Qhorvaan warriors, 2 feet shorter than Qhorvaan, faster in groups, trained in the coordinated movement of beings who shared a single nervous system, filled the passage behind her with the sound of too many legs moving in perfect synchronization. She could not see them yet. She could hear them. The rhythm of Qhorvaan soldiers moving together was not like the sound of individual bodies. It was like the sound of one body with many limbs. It did not slow for obstacles. It did not break formation for corners. It was getting louder. Qhorvaan knew the throne's lower biological bay because she had scouted it in the first hours aboard. The old habit of the severed, mapping exits before anything else. 3 levels down, 2 passage junctions. A drop through a biomembrane seal that would require forcing. She took the first junction at full speed and felt the floor flex under her as the throne's living systems registered her mass and registered simultaneously that she was moving in the wrong direction. Away from the inner chamber, away from the monarch, away from everything the throne's architecture had been grown to facilitate. The walls narrowed slightly, the red light pulsed. The ship was not trying to stop her. It was not capable of directed thought without its monarch. But it was expressing, in the only language available to it, that something was wrong. Everything was wrong. She knew that. She did not have time for it. The second junction opened to her left and she took it without slowing, her damaged shoulder plating scraping the organic wall as she turned. The wall left a smear of her ichor on the biomaterial. The throne absorbed it automatically, the way a living thing absorbs foreign matter. And then something in the absorption process seemed to pause. As though the ship, in the mindless mechanical continuation of its biology, had tasted something unfamiliar and had no instruction for what to do with it. Behind her, the soldiers hit the junction. She heard them without turning, the sound of coordinated bodies adjusting direction, maintaining formation, losing none of the terrible momentum of the harmonics coordination even now, even with Qhorvaan gone because they were not coordinated by her alone. The broader harmonics still moved through them. 16 other monarchs still connected to this ship's crew, still providing the shared consciousness that made Qhorvaan soldiers into a single organism. The ship had lost its center. The soldiers had not lost their connection. They were close, enough that she could feel them in the way severed Qhorvaan could feel the harmonic. Not hearing it, not part of it, but registering its physical presence the way you register the heat of a fire you cannot see. The rage in the frequency, the direction of the focus, all of it pointed at her. The biomembrane seal at the drop to the lower bay was exactly where she remembered it. A circular seal in the floor, organic, grown shut, designed to be opened from the outside by harmonic command. 4 inches thick, the color of old chitin, never opened from the inside in the history of this ship. Qhorvaan hit it with everything she had left. The first strike cracked it. The second broke through. She drove her primary arm into the gap and pulled, feeling the biomaterial resist and stretch and finally tear. The sound of living tissue being forced, loud in the narrow passage. Louder behind it the sound of soldiers 20 meters back and closing. She pulled harder. The seal tore away in 2 pieces, the edges still contracting as she dropped through the gap into the bay below. The lower biological bay was dark. Emergency red only, the same crisis light that had overtaken the entire ship. The space smelled of nutrient fluid and the organic warmth of Qhorvaan biotechnology, alive, functional, waiting. Storage pods lined the walls, scout equipment, the biological equivalent of maintenance supplies. And at the bay's far end, cradled in an organic rack that held it the way a nest holds an egg, the spore skiff. She had seen it in her first scout of the bay and had not known what it was. She knew now. The single-pilot design was unmistakable, once you knew what you were looking at. The size of a large shuttle, shaped like the seed of something massive. Its surface the same deep green as healthy Qhorvaan biomaterial, mottled with the light-sensitive patches that served as its sensory array. She crossed the bay in 6 strides. Behind her, through the torn membrane seal, soldiers dropped through. 1, 2, the sound of coordinated landing, the sound of the harmonic organizing pursuit in the tight space of the lower bay, with the efficiency of something that did not need to think about angles because it was all angles simultaneously. The spore skiff's entry membrane was in its underside. Biocommand activated, harmonic touch required. She had no harmonic. She had a palm against the membrane surface and the artifact pulsing at her thorax, and she pressed both against the skiff and pushed, not with the harmonic but with the desperation of a being who had learned, on Skulveth, that if you pressed hard enough against a thing that was supposed to be closed, sometimes it opened. The membrane resisted. The soldiers were in the bay now. She could hear them spreading into the space without looking, the coordinated search pattern of the harmonic distributing them across the available floor, the way water distributes across a surface. She had seconds. She pressed harder. The artifact pulsed, once, sharp, brighter than it had been in months. Whether it was responding to her desperation or to something older, something that recognized a Qhorvaan biological system and knew how to speak to it. She would never know. The membrane opened. She folded herself through it. The biomembrane sealed behind her before the soldiers reached the skiff. Inside, the pilot's chamber was dark and warm and wet. Nutrient fluid pressed against her from the walls, the suspension system engaging automatically, the skiff coming alive around her in the slow, biological way of Qhorvaan technology that operated more like a body waking up than a machine powering. On his controls presented themselves, not interfaces, not screens, but biological prompts, pressure points in the wall, orientation pads. A navigation cluster that offered preset destinations in Qhorvaan space and a single override command she found not by reading it. She could not read Qhorvaan biological script, but by pressing everything in the cluster until something responded. The override responded. The skiff's drives engaged. The deep subsonic vibration of biological propulsion building from nothing to launch in 4 seconds. Something hit the skiff's exterior. Hard. The soldiers, pressing against. The hull with the coordinated force of the harmonic's direction. The biomembrane of the hull surface dented inward, 1 inch, 2. She could see the impression in the pilot chamber wall, the external pressure transmitted through living material. The drives reached launch capacity. The spore skiff ejected from the Monarch Throne's lower bay through the biohatch that opened, automatically on launch command. And Qhorvaan was suddenly in the void. Around her, the battle was enormous. She had seen it through the throne's membrane window, framed and distant. In the skiff, With nothing between her and the vacuum but the pilot chamber's biomembrane, it was everywhere. Thermal battery flashes lit the void in orange pulses that left afterimages on every one of her eyes. Bioplasma bursts left trails of ionized organic matter that dispersed slowly in the vacuum like breath in cold air. The organism's root tendrils extended through the battle space in every direction, some of them holding ships, some of them drifting free, all of them moving with the slow, patient motion of something that measured time in centuries and was only now beginning to understand that the things around it were not seeds. The fist of Vorkath was visible, half consumed, embedded in the growth's root mass, its running light still active in the sections that still had power, blinking in the red-yellow pattern of a Drakkar vessel declaring catastrophic damage. The spore skiff was smaller than most of the debris floating through the battle space. No faction's targeting system registered it. A seed among wreckage, anonymous, too small to threaten and too small to help. Qhorvaan did not look back at the monarch throne. She found the override and pressed it, and held it, and let the skiff decide. The skiff decided a way. It chose a bearing that pointed between stars, between systems, into the void between the galaxy's arms where nothing was mapped and nothing was waiting. The biological drives built to their transit speed, slow by any other standard, sufficient by the standard of a ship that simply needed to not be here. The battle shrank behind her. The organism's amber pulse dimmed with distance. The thermal battery flashes became small enough to be stars. Inside the pilot chamber, bleeding from 6 places, 2 cracked ribs grinding against each other with every breath, her left eye still fractured and refusing to consolidate its vision, Qhorvaan sat in the nutrient suspension and felt the skiff carry her toward a destination that neither of them knew. The artifact pulsed, steady, patient. She had no way of knowing what she had done to the collective. She had never been in the harmonic. What she knew was that she was alive and moving and the stars were changing around her. For now, that was enough. Then something changed. High-resonant Sivillith felt it first, through the Veilstream, in the sudden disturbance it carried from the boundary where Veilstream met the deep current beneath, a tear in the harmonic so sudden and so specific that she pressed both hands flat against the resonance chamber floor and held her breath. Not the broad disruption of a fleet under fire, not the gradual dimming of a monarch in distress. A severing, clean, absolute, one thread in the harmonic's vast weaving, pulled out all at once. A monarch was dead. She did not know which one. She did not know how. She knew it the way you know a door has been closed in a house you have lived in for decades, not by seeing it, but by the change in how the air moves. On the tactical displays of every ship in the sector, 14 Qhorvaan vessels went dark simultaneously. Not destroyed, their biosignatures still registered, living, breathing, structurally intact, but disconnected. The ships that had been directly threaded through Qhorvaan's neural node, the innermost ring of her formation, the Qhorvaan cruisers and support vessels she had kept closest, lost their harmonic coordination in the same instant. Their formation dissolved, not in retreat, not in rout, in the way of organisms whose nervous system has been severed. They continued moving on their last given vectors. They continued firing on whatever their targeting systems had last locked. But the surgical precision of the harmonic was gone from them, replaced by the raw, feral aggression of Qhorvaan biology operating without direction. The swarm carriers, still connected to the remaining 16 monarchs, did not go dark. The skitter drone clouds did not dissolve. But the pattern of their advance changed, no longer the single organism coordination of Qhorvaan's precise tactical intelligence, now the slightly rougher, slightly angrier coordination of a network that had just absorbed a shock and was redistributing itself around the gap where she had been. 16 monarchs pulling the weight that 17 had carried. It was still enough. It was more than enough. But it was different. On the Hammer's Bridge, Qhorvaan's tactical officer watched the formation shift and said, "The Qhorvaan inner formation has lost cohesion, Overlord. 14 vessels operating independently." Qhorvaan looked at the display. "A monarch is dead." "Confirmed." He looked at the 14 ships moving without coordination, each one continuing on its last vector, no longer part of a whole. Confirmed. No one in the sector knew who had done it. No one would know for some time. The spore skiff that carried... The answer was already beyond sensor range, moving away from everything, carrying a being who did not yet understand the full weight of what she had done. The Fist of Vorkoth was the largest Dreadnought-class ship in the fleet. Not the Hammer. The Hammer was beyond classification, a vessel that existed in a category of one. But the Fist was the best of what the Dominion built in quantity. 50,000 warriors, armament sufficient to reduce a moon's surface to slag, named as all Drakkar ships were named for the purpose it was built to serve. Qhorvaan watched it die from the Hammer's bridge. He had made the calculation before the battle started. The Fist was already damaged. A Qhorvaan bioplasma battery had found its port reactor housing in the battle's second hour, reducing its speed and half its weapons capability. A Dreadnought at half capacity was still a considerable weapon. A Dreadnought caught by the organism's root tendrils was a liability. "Fist of Vorkoth," Qhorvaan said. The channel was direct encrypted, commander to commander. "Bearing 375, full engine capacity. Ram the organism's primary root mass at the gate-facing quadrant." Silence on the channel. 6 seconds. "Overlord, the Fist's commander, an officer named Rekka, Clan Drekval, 15 years of service. Confirmed?" "Confirmed." Another silence. Then, "Understood, Overlord." No protest, no appeal. The Drakkar did not do either when the order was clear, and the source was clear, and the logic, however brutal, was clear. The Fist turned, its remaining engines fired at full capacity. The Drakkar creed did not require understanding the sacrifice to accept it. It required only that it served. The impact was visible from every ship in the sector. The Fist hit the organism's primary root mass at 0.04 standard velocity, slow by the measure of space combat, catastrophic by the measure of living tissue meeting 60,000 tons of Vorkoth metal at force. The growth's bark split across a surface area, 3 miles wide. Bioluminescent sap. Vast quantities of it, the amber fluid that carried the organism's circulatory system throughout its continent-sized body, vented into the void, crystallizing instantly in the cold and scattering across the battle space, like a field of amber stars. No sound came from it. It had no mechanism for sound in the vacuum. But through the Veilstream, Sivlith felt it. A pulse of something that was not pain but was the closest thing to it that a Verdanthis biology could produce. A disruption, a sudden absence of connection where connection had been. The Fist did not survive the impact intact. Its forward third collapsed inward, the hull failing under the reciprocal force of hitting something that was, in its own way, as dense as a ship. But it did not sink. It remained embedded in the organism's root mass, held by the tendrils. That had immediately begun responding to the intrusion, closing around the wreckage with the automatic response of a wound attempting to seal. Absorption began. Not instantly. Slowly over hours that the battle did not have. The living root material pressed through gaps in the Fist's hull, reaching inward with the patient certainty of vines covering a clearing. Drakkar metal is resistant to most things. It was not resistant to this. The organism did not know it was consuming a warship. It was doing what it had been grown to do, integrating, growing, absorbing what it found into itself. But the Fist was not a seed. It was 60,000 tons of Vorkoth metal and Dreadnought-class weaponry, and as the organism's biology worked its slow way through it, the incompatibility registered. Something in the root system, in the deep structural tissue where the gate seed had buried itself, began to react to the metal, not retreating, incorporating, changing. The growth shuddered. Its surface bioluminescence flickered across 3 miles of bark, and then it began, very slowly, to move, not charging, not retreating, drifting, the massive, ponderous drift of something continent-sized shifting its center of mass, the root tendrils pulling inward to accommodate the new mass embedded in its gate-facing quadrant. The motion was barely perceptible by battle standards. By the standards of a Verdanthi's emissary, it was violent. Qhorvaan watched it on the tactical display. "It is moving away from the gate," his tactical officer said. "Yes," Qhorvaan said. "It is clearing our engagement space." Qhorvaan looked at the display. The organism's drift was creating a gap between its root field and the hammer's position, a gap that would, in approximately 20 minutes, give the Drakkar fleet room to maneuver they had not had since the battle started. The fist's sacrifice had bought them that. He had known it would. That was the calculation. He looked at the hammer's sensor readings. The Qhorvaan fleet was pressing. 16 chitin cruisers still fully functional. The swarm carriers had deployed, and the skitter drones were moving through the battle space in clouds of 10,000. Not targeting yet, still organizing, the harmonic coordinating their distribution with the terrible patience of a species that planned in organisms rather than units. 2 dreadnoughts had gone dark. 3 more were damaged. The Veilstream scouts were threading through the edges of the engagement, pulling their own people out and staying out of the main exchange with the careful discipline of a faction that knew its limits. The humans were not present in any meaningful way. Brief flashes on the long-range sensors, the Defiance, 3 freeborn haulers, the scattered remnants of the human formation trying to use the chaos to complete their evacuation. They were not a factor in this battle. They were witnesses to it. Qhorvaan looked at the hammer of Qhorvaan. Over a mile of Vorkath metal, the largest warship any species had ever constructed. Ugly by design, raw, unpolished hull plating, its weapons systems visible on the exterior like ribs on a starving animal, its engines producing a drive signature that could be detected at the edge of the sector. No grace to it, no elegance, pure function expressed in metal. He had ordered it built in the last year of his reign because the clans needed to see that the Overlord's power was real. Because an Overlord who commanded the largest warship ever. Built was an Overlord who could still hold 5 clans together through presence alone, even when his body was failing. The hammer had been that presence. For 2 years, it had held. He made the calculation. Not cold. Not without weight. He had been making Drakkar calculations for 60 years, and he had never once convinced himself they were without weight. The weight was the point. You bore it or you did not. That was what the office demanded. The Qhorvaan swarm carriers had deployed. In 20 minutes, perhaps 30, the skitter drones would be in organized formation. What that meant for the battle. For the sector, for every ship still present, required no tactical expertise to understand. Every captain in the Drakkar fleet knew it. Every Veilstream scout commander knew it. The humans, watching from the sector's edge, knew it. The organism was still absorbing the fist, still drifting, still carrying in its cognitive center the thing that the Qhorvaan had come here to destroy. Qhorvaan opened a fleet-wide channel. Every Drakkar ship in the sector. "This is Overlord Qhorvaan." His voice was steady. It had been steady for 60 years. It was steady now. "All vessels, disengage and withdraw from the sector. Maximum speed. Leave now." A pause. The kind of pause that happens when an entire fleet hears something and cannot immediately process it. "Overlord. Now," Qhorvaan said. The word carried what it had always carried, 60 years of absolute authority, and the weight of an authority that knew it was giving its last command. "Clan commanders will confirm withdrawal in sequence. Thorax detachment will receive separate orders. All other vessels, leave." The fleet began to move, not enthusiastically. Drakkar fleets did not retreat enthusiastically, but they moved because the Overlord had ordered it, and the Overlord's voice still carried the weight of a being who had held 5 clans together for 60 years. Qhorvaan closed the fleet channel. He opened a channel to the hammer's helmsman. "Full acceleration," he said. "Bearing for the organism's central root mass, gate-facing quadrant, same point of impact as the fist." The helmsman did not hesitate. The Drakkar way. "Aye, Overlord." Qhorvaan stood. The effort cost him. His joints protested every movement now, the broken-down machinery of a body that had been held together by stubbornness for a decade. He stood anyway, and walked to the forward viewport and looked at the growth in the distance. the amber and gold-white pulse of it, vast and patient and carrying something inside it that neither the organism nor the factions could fully understand yet. He thought about the vision the gate had shown him. The Iron Hall, the new overlord on the dais, bone plating thick, luminescent, making 5 clans kneel not through politics but through the fundamental recognition of something stronger. His own sword on the wall, clean, mounted, final. The sire. Vision had not shown him this, but the vision had been clear about the price, and the price was him, and the manner in which a price was paid did not change its value. He reached into the place where, 60 years ago, he would have been able to lift his longsword and found it occupied by the tremor that had replaced the strength. He left his hand there anyway, in the position, in the gesture. "Warlord Thorok," he said. The channel was open. Somewhere in the vault, in whatever crisis Warlord Thorok was currently navigating, the Warlord would hear this. "Get your soldiers out. Get off that ship. I am leaving you the fleet." He paused. The strongest wins. The hammer of Qhorvaan accelerated. Unlike the fist, this impact was something else entirely. The fist had been a dreadnought, enormous, yes, but within the range of what the galaxy's physics expected from a large object moving at speed. The hammer was something else. Over a mile of metal, its engines designed for a wartime speed that pushed the tolerances of Drakkar engineering to their absolute limit. Every thermal battery in its hull firing as it closed the distance, not at the organism, at the space ahead of it, clearing debris and Qhorvaan biomatter and the crystallized sap of the fist's impact point with sustained volleys that lit the approach path like a second sun. The Qhorvaan fleet scattered, not in retreat, in the instinctive response of living things to something that was not a threat to them specifically, but was catastrophic in their direction. The Chiton cruisers adjusted bearing. The swarm carriers pulled back. And in the inner chamber of the monarch throne, Qhorvaan no longer stood at the membrane window, and the harmonic carried the hammer's approach without her voice to answer it, and there were no orders to give. You moved out of the way of something like this, or you did not. The impact hit the organism at 0.12 standard velocity. What happened next lasted 11 seconds. Every sensor in every ship recorded it differently. The Velithari scouts registered it as a Veilstream rupture, a tear in the metaphysical fabric of the sector, the kind of event that the deep current literature described in theoretical terms, and that no Velithari scholar had ever expected to witness. Sivillith in the resonance chamber felt the Veilstream fold, and then unfold in a different configuration than it had been, and then fold again, and then, briefly, stop being the Veilstream she recognized. The Drakkar sensors recorded a warp event, uncontrolled, not the Qhorvaan-class precision warp that their warp breaker ships produced, but a catastrophic spatial compression caused by the interaction of the hammer's drive systems, at maximum output, with the organism's deep current-connected biology at the moment of impact. The numbers did not repeat any known phenomenon. Several sensors reported outputs that their calibration systems could not categorize and defaulted to error codes that no Drakkar technician had seen before. What every sensor agreed on, the hammer of Qhorvaan and a significant portion of the organism's central mass, including, the Qhorvaan would later determine, the region where the gate's corrupted seed had established itself most deeply, disappeared from Sector Auris 7. No trajectory, no exit vector, no transit signature. Gone. The remaining fragment of the organism, perhaps 40% of its original mass, the portions furthest from the impact point, the root tendrils and outer bark and the inhabited chambers where its young consciousness had formed, drifted, disconnected from its cognitive center. Alive, technically. Aware, perhaps. But no longer organized in the way it had been. A thing broken at its center, still standing in places, still breathing, but no longer a single thing. The fist of Vorkoth, half absorbed in the organism's root mass, drifted with it. The sector was silent. For 7 seconds, nothing fired. Vasquez heard the hammer go dark on the communications channel and said nothing for a long time. The Defiance was running, not retreating. running in the way that a ship runs when it has taken enough damage that retreat is an optimistic word for what is actually happening. Hull integrity at 41%. Deck 9 was open to vacuum and sealed off. The medical bay had stopped counting at some point and started prioritizing. The sensor array had been replaced by a jury-rigged secondary that gave them 80% coverage and overheated every 40 minutes. They were still evacuating. The shuttles were making runs. 3 runs each had been the plan, before the crossfire made a 4th run a death sentence. They had made 4 anyway, and then 5, because when you were watching people on a dock, you did not simply stop. The 6th run had cost them a shuttle, caught in the edge of a Qhorvaan bioplasma exchange, not targeted, simply present. 14. Marines aboard, gone. The ships were full, past full. Vasquez had received the same report from 11 captains in the last hour, delivered in varying degrees of desperation. We cannot hold more. The structural tolerances, the life support calculations, the arithmetic of bodies and oxygen, and a ship designed to carry 200 people now carrying 800. He looked at the dock feeds, people still there, hundreds, possibly thousands in the sections of the vault still accessible. His shuttles could not reach them all before the swarm carriers finished deploying. His ships could not carry them if they could. How many have we taken? He asked. His communications officer checked again. Across all vessels, 55,000 approximately. Some ships have stopped reporting accurate numbers. 55,000 out of 400,000, out of over 500,000 if the vault's population estimates were correct. Vasquez looked at the tactical display, the swarm carriers, the skitter drones beginning to organize in their terrible patient clouds. The vault of whispered ledgers. Below, dark in sections, burning in others, its market decks and intelligence warrens and residential blocks full of people his ships could not reach. Captain. His first officer. Quietly. We need to leave. Vasquez looked at the dock feeds for another 3 seconds. The people on the dock. The space between them and his shuttles that was filling with things that had only one purpose. Leave, he said. He did not elaborate. He did not explain. He closed the dock feeds and looked at the viewport and felt the weight of 55,000 people in 17 damaged ships settle into the part of him where the things that could not be undone lived, and he added it to everything already. There. The human fleet left. Behind them, the vault of whispered ledgers waited for what was coming. Then the swarm carriers opened. End of episode 10. And thank you for listening.